The sun was bleeding over the hills of Macedonia, and the ancient capital of Aegae glimmered like it was carved from fire. That day was meant to be triumph itself. King Philip II of Macedon had crushed every rival, forged a chaotic land into a war machine, and now stood at the peak of his power. His daughter's wedding was more than a celebration. It was a declaration that nothing could stop him. Musicians played from the balconies, garlands hung from marble columns, and every street overflowed with nobles from across Greece. Wine poured like rivers. Soldiers in polished bronze armor lined the streets, their spears catching the sunset like shards of flame. And at the center of it all strode Philip, undefeated, untouchable, ready to launch his grand campaign to conquer Persia and crown himself the master of the known world. But what no one knew, not even Philip himself, was that death was already walking among them. In the shadows behind the spectacle stood Pausanias of Orestes, one of Philip's own royal bodyguards. To the crowd, he was invisible. To Philip, he had once been a favorite, a trusted man allowed closer than anyone. But betrayal breeds from closeness. Pausanias had been humiliated, left unprotected by the king he once adored, and that humiliation had turned to a cold, silent hatred. For months, he had stood behind Philip with dead eyes, smiling when required, waiting for the moment to strike. That moment had come. Trumpets blared. The crowd roared. Philip stepped into the open-air theater, smiling, radiant, flanked by nobles and foreign ambassadors. He wanted the world to see him without fear, so he ordered his guards to stay back, out of sight, a gesture of arrogance that would cost him everything. And then it happened, a blur of movement, a flash of steel. Pausanias lunged from the procession, driving a dagger straight into Philip's chest. For an instant, time shattered. Gasps became screams. The king staggered, blood blooming across his white robe like a crimson flower. He collapsed on the marble steps as chaos detonated around him. Guests trampled each other to escape. Musicians dropped their instruments. Soldiers roared, drawing blades. But Pausanias was already sprinting, shoving through the panicked crowd. He almost made it. Almost. Royal guards on horseback crashed into him, spears skewering him to the ground. He died thrashing in the dust as the celebration dissolved into a frenzy of terror. And through it all, one figure stood frozen. Alexander the Great, just 19 years old, watching his father bleed out on the steps, realizing the entire world had just fallen into his hands. The wedding had become a blood-soaked coronation. The old king's empire trembled on the edge of collapse, and Alexander was already staring into the storm he would unleash. The body of Philip II lay in state like a fallen god. Draped in royal purple, crowned with gold, his corpse was displayed for 3 full days in Aegae. The air reeked of incense, and yet it could not mask the sour stench of death creeping through the hall. Mourners wailed, ambassadors whispered, generals paced like wolves. The throne of Macedonia stood empty, and everyone knew what that meant. Power was up for the taking. Alexander did not weep. He stood silent at the foot of his father's bier, his youthful face carved from stone, his eyes fixed not on the corpse, but on the crown. He knew the truth no one dared to speak aloud. Philip's empire was a powder keg. The moment his blood cooled, rival princes would lunge for the throne, the nobles would fracture, and Greece would revolt. And Philip's murder had made it worse. Pausanias had died before he could speak, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some said the plot came from Olympias, Alexander's own mother, a woman as beautiful as she was terrifying, who despised Philip's new young wife and would stop at nothing to see her son on the throne. Others whispered that even Alexander himself had known, that he had watched the blade go in with cold eyes. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In the bloody world of kingship, perception was everything, and perception could kill. Within hours of Philip's funeral pyre crackling to ash, the palace became a battlefield of daggers in the dark. Philip's new wife and her baby daughter were found dead, their throats slit in the royal chambers. The surviving generals who hesitated to swear loyalty to Alexander were dragged from their homes at night and vanished. The young prince moved like a storm through the palace, purging rivals with surgical brutality. Then came the revolt. News arrived like thunder from the south. Athens and Thebes, two cities Philip had beaten into submission, were rising in rebellion, believing the boy king would be too weak to stop them. Alexander's answer was pure fire. He summoned his father's veterans, men who had fought in 100 battles, and led them himself. At just 19, he rode at the head of a steel tide through the mountain passes, striking like lightning. When he reached Thebes, the city refused to open its gates. So Alexander ordered the attack. His siege engines smashed through the walls in a single day. The Macedonian army poured in like wolves. Thebes burned, its people were slaughtered or sold into slavery. By the next dawn, nothing remained but ash and silence. The message was clear to Greece and to the world. The boy was king now. And as the smoke of Thebes curled into the sky, Alexander rode through the ruins, calm as stone. He had secured his throne with blood, but deep in his mind, one thought had already begun to burn. His father's dream. Persia, the empire of kings. The place Philip had planned to conquer before the dagger struck. Now that dream belonged to Alexander, and he would pursue it across the edge of the world until either it or he lay in ruins. Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont under a sky the color of steel. The sea boiled beneath their ships, and the men stood in silence, knowing they were leaving their homeland behind, perhaps forever. Ahead lay Persia, a world so vast and rich it seemed carved from myth. For 2 centuries, the Persian kings had been the shadow looming over Greece. Now, a 19-year-old king from the northern hills was coming for them. When Alexander leapt onto the Asian shore, he drove his spear into the earth and declared it conquered. It was not bravado, it was prophecy. The Persians laughed at first. Their empire stretched from Egypt to India, while Alexander commanded barely 40,000 men, but he moved like fire on dry grass. At the Battle of Granicus, he charged straight across the river, his horses' hooves churning water and blood, cutting through the Persian cavalry like a scythe. At Issus, he smashed an army 10 times his size by driving his companion cavalry like a blade through the enemy center, straight toward Darius III himself. Darius fled, abandoning his mother, wife, and children to capture. Alexander treated them not as prisoners, but as royalty, a gesture that stunned the world and sowed doubt inside the Persian court. As he marched deeper, resistance crumbled before him. Cities opened their gates without a fight. Temples hailed him as a god. Even his own men began to whisper that perhaps he was. but power burns those who hold it too tightly. The farther he marched, the stranger Alexander became. He adopted Persian dress, Persian rituals, even Persian bodyguards. At night, he roamed alone through the dark halls of conquered palaces, staring at ancient statues, speaking to them as if they were alive. Those who questioned him found themselves silenced, sometimes by exile, sometimes by the sword. And still he pushed on toward the beating heart of Persia, toward Gaugamela. It was there that Darius gathered the full strength of his empire, nearly 250,000 men, war elephants, scythe chariots, an ocean of bronze and iron under a burning eastern sun. Alexander surveyed them with cold eyes. Behind him, barely 47,000 Macedonians waited, outnumbered 5-1. When dawn broke, Alexander gave the only order he knew: attack. The Macedonians advanced like a black tide, their sarissas bristling. Alexander rode his white stallion Bucephalus like a storm god, sweeping in a wide arc, drawing the Persian left flank away. And then, at the perfect moment, he turned and drove straight through the gap in the Persian center like a thunderbolt. He cut through to Darius. The Persian king fled again, his chariot vanishing in the dust. His army collapsed. Persia was broken, and Alexander stood at its heart, crowned in blood. The treasures of Babylon, Persepolis, and Susa poured at his feet like rivers of gold. He became the master of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. From the deserts of Egypt to the snows of India, kings bowed before him. His name was whispered like a god's. But conquest is a poison. The boy who once stood silent before his father's corpse was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a man who believed himself destined to rule not just men, but time itself. He began to see betrayal everywhere. Old comrades who had bled for him were struck down on suspicion alone. At a drunken feast in Bactria, he murdered his friend Clitus the Black with his own spear for contradicting him. He wept afterward, but the weeping changed nothing. The terror had begun. His men marched with haunted eyes, bones showing through their skin. They had followed him across continents, but the farther they went, the more it felt like they were chasing a ghost or being hunted by one. In India, they finally broke. After a brutal battle on the banks of the Hyphasis River, they refused to go further. Alexander raged, begged, threatened, but even he could not bend exhausted spirits forever. He turned back, leaving the edge of the world unconquered. By the time he staggered back to Babylon, he was barely human. His body rotted from fevers, his voice cracked like old stone, yet his mind still burned with impossible dreams. He began planning the conquest of Arabia, and then suddenly it ended. One night, in June 323 BCE, Alexander collapsed after a fevered banquet. He lay speechless for days, surrounded by generals who watched not with grief, but calculation. At just 32, the greatest conqueror in history died, and left no heir. His empire shattered like glass. His generals carved it to pieces, drowning it in decades of civil wars. Cities burned, maps were redrawn in blood, and the dream of one world under one crown dissolved into ashes. But the shadow of Alexander never left. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, the world still speaks his name. A boy who became a god, and a god who became a ghost.